At the end of the Second World War, Yugoslavia was in a rather unique position. As one of the primary belligerents of the conflict, the people of this country were the only ones to liberate themselves from fascist occupation almost entirely on their own. Therefore, Yugoslavia became the only European nation directly involved in the conflict that had not previously been or still was occupied with Soviet or Allied soldiers post-war. As a result, the Yugoslavs independently built up their new economic and government institutions with the intent of following the Soviet model of economic development. But in 1948, as we discussed in our last video, Yugoslavia was denounced as a revisionist counter-revolutionary entity and then subsequently expelled from the Cominform. Yugoslavia for a time then had become somewhat of a rogue state. As a socialist nation, it received no love from the West. But now, as a revisionist and even fascist country, it was left completely isolated from the socialist world. Up until the 1948 split, the Eastern Bloc had represented 48% of all of Yugoslavia's imports. But now, they were cut off and the Eastern Bloc set up an economic blockade, eventually ceasing all trade with the country. In this politically and economically bizarre situation, the Yugoslav Communist Party was very much forced to chart out a new path, a path vastly different from the Soviet model that they previously upheld. Past 1949, there was both an ideological and economic necessity for change in the country. Expelled from the socialist world, no longer seen as genuine Marxists, they could not follow in the same footsteps as those who had shunned them. But at the same time, they had also faced drastic issues in their own attempts to mimic Soviet methods. Two things had become clear. Firstly, Yugoslavia needed to distinguish itself as a socialist nation. It was also desperately in need of a reform to its own economic system. These two necessities became one and the same as an important political economic goal. It was in this environment that the Yugoslav communists came to create their infamous variant of the system of worker self-management. It was from that moment onward that the Yugoslav communists began to walk on a completely separate path from the Soviet Union. But before we get to that, let us start from the beginning and discuss the original economic program of the Yugoslavs before they became, quote-unquote, revisionist. The foundation of the Yugoslav planned economy did not begin when the new socialist Yugoslav state was established in 1945. Rather, we can find its origins in the middle of the Second World War itself. In the midst of the war, just as the Yugoslav communists were creating those bodies which would later serve to form their future government apparatus, and as the KPJ was recoiling from its attempt at implementing the radical measures of its class program, institutions had been set up to coordinate economic and social life in areas under their control. As early as 1942, Susan Woodward states that the, quote, skeleton of a planned economy had appeared. With the creation of the AVNOJ, the partisans formed both a central economic and administrative commission, whose respective purposes were to set policies on production and distribution and acquire economic data which would then be incorporated into a basic plan. When the partisans transitioned from local governance to national governance after the foundation of the new republic in 1945, they quickly found that their new country rested upon a rather shaky and unfortunate economic foundation. The economy was in shambles. The country made use of 7 completely different currencies, and much of the nation's industry had been destroyed. Still, as the undisputed masters of the country, the communists were tasked with rebuilding the nation. The first thing that the Yugoslav communists did was enact a program of land reform. Millions of acres of land were nationalized. Expropriated large landowner estates were broken up and distributed to poor peasants. Peasant debt was canceled and church property was confiscated by the state. The new policy in regards to the peasantry, i.e. the policy of accruing surplus from them, was introduced in 1946 and was rather similar to Preobrazhensky's model of extracting surplus for accumulation, that being a compulsory tax in kind, non-negotiable, fixed low agricultural prices, and a high monetary taxation on the peasantry. New laws were introduced that also sought to restrict the growth of private agriculture. Hired labor on private plots was banned, and much propaganda was put out promoting and encouraging peasants to go and join cooperative farms. To further entice peasants to join cooperative farms, the state only provided collective farmers with agricultural machinery. By spring of 1948, it was Yugoslavia and Bulgaria that had the highest percentage of collectivized agriculture out of all the Eastern European people's democracies. In Yugoslavia alone, almost 350,000 hectares of land was used for collective farming. Planning by law would be introduced in June of 1946. The Federal Planning Commission began drawing up the nation's first, and funnily enough, last 5-year plan. Enacted in 1947, the main goal of the first 5-year plan was the construction of a great number of new factories. But following the Soviet model, the majority of these would be factories involved in heavy industry. In the years after World War II, Yugoslavia's economy was geared towards national development and reconstruction. Contrasted with the rest of Europe, the Balkans in the early 20th century had been comparatively underdeveloped, even by Eastern European standards, strangled by Ottoman domination for centuries, and toyed with as the junior partner to larger powers on the international stage. Karađorđević's Serbia failed to modernize during its lifetime. Domestic capital not forthcoming, the kingdom made itself open to foreign investment and began a late industrialization drive in the 1930s. But the proletariat in Yugoslavia, even as late as 1940, did not even make up 1% of the population. In 1940, Belgrade, the capital city of Yugoslavia and the largest city in Serbia, had about 300,000 inhabitants. Across 300 businesses within the city, there were only 30,000 workers. The neophyte Yugoslav working class was lacking in presence, political power, and tradition. The class that represented the primary base of the communists during their liberation war and during the post-war reconstruction period would be the peasantry, not the proletariat. The entire Yugoslav situation, then, was truly topsy-turvy from the standpoint of the Marxist doctrine. Even worse for Tito and his crew, and as we mentioned earlier, much of the already rather weak pre-war Serbian industrial base and infrastructure had been destroyed during the course of the war or was expropriated by the Nazis. But up north in Slovenia, we do find the opposite story. Unsere deutschen Freunde nennen Ostslowenien slowenische Steiermark. Das bedeutet auf English Lower Styria. So while the Nazis carved up and gave away most of Yugoslavia to its allies or puppet regimes, they viewed this area of Slovenia as rightful German territory. They then began construction projects in the region as if it were any other part of the Reich. In Maribor, for example, the future TAM factory was constructed in Tesno. It operated as a military factory, producing important equipment for the Wehrmacht. Much of the infrastructure that the Nazis had built up in Tesno ended up being undamaged, and most of the machinery was left behind. Unfortunately for the Slovenians and the KPJ, this was true of most of the industry that existed in the north, where it was historically concentrated anywhere. Now, even though Hitler blessed Tito with a fully intact and modern factory in Slovenia, elsewhere, the KPJ was left with rampant destruction. In each of the SFRY's republics, new schools, railways, hospitals, and factories for various industrial branches were constructed. As a part of its path towards industrialization, Yugoslavia enacted and encouraged its own domestic variant of Stakhanovism. Shock workers, or udarniks as they were called in Yugoslavia, who exceeded quotas or provided excellent services to their workplaces, were rewarded with gifts, privileges, and social renown. The Yugoslav state also mobilized its populace into quote-unquote volunteer labor brigades, acquiring a vast amount of free labor for its reconstruction efforts. In the countryside, so-called shock weeks were organized to repair damage and rebuild destroyed towns. As loyal Marxist-Leninists, the Yugoslavs wished to emulate the Soviet model. Therefore, they sought rapid industrialization via a focus on heavy industry and a neglect of consumer goods and agriculture. Post-war, all of the industrial and agricultural property that was owned and operated by the foreign bourgeoisie, which up until that point accounted for half of the Yugoslav economy, as well as all the property that belonged to any Quislings, was expropriated. The first set of post-war nationalizations occurred in 1946. Initially, nationalization was only limited to various large-scale industries like mining, banking, and wholesale trade. In 1948, nationalization was extended to the remaining non-industrial sectors such as retail trade, hospitals, hotels, etc. Those elements of the petty bourgeoisie and peasantry who fought with the communists would give up their property without asking any questions, for they believed it was their national duty, at least according to Branko Horvat. Eventually, all large-scale enterprises would become nationalized. Factory managers within the state-owned economy were appointed by the party, working to fulfill whatever goals were set out in the plans that were given from the top. All that remained of a private sector during this period were small-scale petty bourgeois artisans and those remnant private farmers that hadn't joined any co-ops. I said earlier that a change to the system had become necessary by the time of the transition to self-management. That's because even before Yugoslavia was blockaded by Comecon, the Yugoslav economy post-war had already been suffering. The typical problems were poor economic planning and excessive supervision in established economic plans, particularly the desire to fulfill the plan's quantitative goals at the cost of the quality of the product being produced. And those goals often still did not manage to be fulfilled. Since Yugoslavia was lacking a proper working class, much of its post-war reconstruction workforce were peasants recruited to the factories, and many peasants resisted being conscripted to work in those factories. And those who did find themselves making the switch from agrarian to industrial labor found themselves operating in poor working conditions with limited or no housing. Quite unused to harsh and grueling factory work that sometimes consisted of 12-hour shifts, there tended to be a high turnover rate amongst peasant workers. The obvious results of this unstable workforce, coupled with a lack of resources, raw materials, trained technicians, or up-to-date technology, was the inability to even produce the planned amount of goods. A notable example of this occurs in the previously mentioned Slovene TAM factory. As Musić notes, in 1947, the economic plan called for 250 vehicles to be produced by the factory that year. They only made 29. In 1948, they needed to produce 700 chassis. They only made 119. In 1949, the factory planned initially to produce 2,000 vehicles. The Comecon blockade forced them to revise their goal to 1,250 vehicles, a 47% decrease from their original goal. Their final tally? Only 288 vehicles, which represented only 14% of the original target. Bureaucratic incompetence was also widespread amongst the neophyte Yugoslav political establishment, comprised mainly of ex-partisans of peasant background. Yugoslav planning was so bad, apparently, that the architect of the country's first 5-year plan, Boris Kidrić, allegedly said as a joke that the best weapon which the Yugoslavs had against the United States would be to send over 2 Yugoslav planners to ruin their entire economy. Horvat describes the situation further. By 1947, the machinery for central planning was completed. Hierarchically organized planning commissions on various levels, federal, state, district, and city, were entrusted with comprehensive plans in their respective territories. Operational planning and implementation was carried out by ministries, and then, down the line, by general and chief directorates and planning sections in the enterprises. Annual plans were broken down into quarterly, monthly, and 10-day plans. In 1949, about 13,000 groups of commodities were planned. In the same year, the state budget comprised 2/3 of the national income. Every enterprise had to supply the higher authorities with 600 to 800 different reports per year. The annual economic plan weighed some 3,300 pounds. Suppliers and customers were assigned to every enterprise in advance. The economy was run as a single mammoth enterprise that required establishing a system of continuous control of operations of all enterprises. In 1948, Boris Kidrić voiced complaints against those who felt there was no need for daily reporting and were satisfied with 10-day reporting. A number of years later, J. Stanovnik, now Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Europe, was asked at a lecture delivered to Swedish economists in Stockholm what sort of devices were used to implement plans in Yugoslavia. He answered, telephones. Yugoslavia did not have the technical know-how, the industrial base, or the experience necessary for its initial economic objectives. The Yugoslavs were highly reliant on foreign aid and technology, and Yugoslavia's first 5-year plan was based primarily upon Soviet economic assistance. As loyal communists, the Yugoslavs wished to emulate their teachers. They desired but also required the economic stimulus and technical expertise which the Soviets would have provided. Therefore, when the Yugoslavs were expelled from the Cominform, followed immediately after by an economic blockade by Comecon, not even 1 year into their 5-year plan, a plan which, mind you, was already facing difficulties, the situation became rather untenable. Still, despite being exiled, the Yugoslavs tried to continue down the Soviet route for a time. Around 1947, the Yugoslavs began to adopt a less violent method of introducing the peasants into cooperative farms. This is the origin of the accusations of Bukharinism against them. Now, while I think the allegations of so-called Bukharinism are nonsense, especially if you consider that Bukharin's program was more complex than simply letting peasants own private farms, there were certain similarities. For one, the Yugoslavs decided early on that in their country, industrialization was not going to be based primarily on collectivization as it had in the USSR. Secondly, a more peaceful approach to the peasant had been taken, as the party which came to power through the support of the peasantry was not keen on alienating its primary/only support base. The Yugoslavs, therefore, did not take the route of forced collectivization. They believed instead that the more well-to-do peasants could be, quote-unquote, convinced by their poorer counterparts to join the co-op farms by showing them that they were superior. Swain describes Cardell's approach as follows. Writing Agricultural Cooperatives in a Planned Economy in September 1947, Cardell was relaxed that Yugoslavia was embarking on the process of industrialization, while most agricultural cooperatives were general agricultural cooperatives, Obsta Zemljoradnička Zadruga, rather than the labor-pooling peasant work cooperatives, Seljačka Radna Zadruga. His argument was that, as ever more machine tractor stations were established, so the move to pooled labor would intensify spontaneously. When the Central Committee Plenum of January 1949 endorsed the policy of collectivization, the clear intention of the resolution was that the party should put greater emphasis on establishing SRZs. Yet even now, although Cardell recognized the need to oppose the trading activities of the kulaks, he saw no reason to exclude them from the cooperative farms, as had happened in the Soviet Union. It was only after Yugoslavia was kicked out of the Cominform that coercive measures were introduced. As Scher says, quote, the first reaction of the Yugoslav communists after the initial shock of excommunication was not to nail their heretical theses to the door of the cathedral, but to seek to demonstrate their adherence to Stalinist policies at the same time as they cleansed their ranks of all those who dared to voice explicit support of Stalin himself or of the charges in the resolution. They wished to, as they said, refute the accusations with their deeds. Between 1948 and 1949, they enacted and hastened a collectivization drive in the countryside. When in 1948 there were 1,217 peasant cooperatives, by 1950 there would be almost 7,000. The peasants would be encouraged through propaganda and coerced with administrative measures to join cooperative farms. Yugoslav communist policy caused huge backlash in the countryside. It created a fierce movement of resistance against the collectivization campaign. Pro-Soviet dissidents would also take advantage of the turmoil to ferment and spread unrest in Yugoslavia. All across the country, uprisings would occur, the most notable incidents being the Kazan Rebellion in Bosnia that ended with the arrest of hundreds of people. In 1949, the collective farms would indeed manage to achieve a high output, but the cause of this achievement was the arrest of 12,000 people. Still, the apparent success of the farms wouldn't even last. The productive output of the collective farms would fall in 1950, and a drought that year would only serve to make matters worse. The Yugoslav communists believed that if they demonstrated through their actions that they weren't revisionist, that they were committed Marxist-Leninists, then they would be accepted back into the Eastern fold. But as it became clear that this naive plan wasn't going to work, it was understood at the highest levels that from both an economic and political standpoint that something needed to change. Already in 1948 and 1949, as the economic blockade was taking its toll on the Yugoslav economy, Tito took out a loan from the British and began to secretly accept Marshall Plan aid and assistance from the United States so that he could be kept afloat for the time being. As I mentioned in the intro, the transition away from the Soviet model was an ideological necessity as much as it was an economic one. For the Yugoslavs, it became clear that the only means by which they could be readmitted into the communist world was by essentially becoming a Soviet colony or vassal, which was something they refused to do. They weren't, however, simply going to abandon communism and go running arms open to the West. Not only did their upper leadership need to stick to their program, for it was an ideal that they spent their whole lives fighting for. How could they abandon it just because they had been abandoned? They also needed to provide a believable explanation rooted in Marxism as to why an alternative route was being taken after years of promoting the USSR as the ideal representative of everything they stood for. The standard story on how self-management came to be is that the top leadership of the KPJ began to re-examine Marxism. It was through their rereading of Marx that they, or rather, Gilas, came across references to free association and workers' control. There it was, the issue with the Soviet model was found. It was bureaucratization and statism that caused Soviet socialism to degenerate. In Yugoslav eyes, it was the Soviets who were the revisionists, and not they. As Swain writes, abandoning the notion that the dispute with Stalin had essentially revolved around a misunderstanding which rational debate should have been able to resolve, the Yugoslav communists now argued that while they had remained true to Marxism-Leninism, Stalin had abandoned it. At the plenum, Gilas stressed that, in defending the specific path of Yugoslav development, we in fact do not defend some kind of national independence of Yugoslavia or some kind of right of Yugoslavia to independent development. We are defending proletarian Marxist-Leninism, internationalism from those who distort it. The proper and genuinely Marxist way forward, then, for the KPJ leadership, was to incorporate the workers not just into the system of organized production, but the role of governance as well. This was to be the origin of Yugoslav self-management. The situation of economic isolation also caused, or perhaps forced, the Yugoslavs to look westward for new trading partners. Harold Lydall suggests that perhaps another one of the reasons that the Yugoslavs switched away from the planned economy was to make their country look more palatable for Western capitalists who might seek to invest. Previously, the KPJ was a devout Marxist-Leninist party, and it told all of its people that it followed the line of Marx, Lenin, Stalin. In 1949, they could no longer do this because they had been repudiated by Stalin. Thus, as the Yugoslavs developed a new economic system, they also adopted a new ideology. An ideology that was still rooted in Marxism, but one which emphasized the more, libertarian, so to speak, aspects of it. In the first year following their expulsion, as I mentioned previously, the Yugoslavs stuck to the Stalinist route, at least concerning collectivization of agriculture. Regarding the factories, Cornell had already begun to advocate for the implementation of something different. In late December 1949, the very first experiments in worker self-management took place in a little over 200 factories. It'll be the next year, in June 1950, that Tito and the Yugoslav communists would specifically orient themselves onto the path of self-management, making it a core aspect of their journey to socialism. At first, Tito was under the impression that the workers of Yugoslavia were not ready for such a system, that they lacked experience, and that its adoption so soon would be premature. However, his cohorts, Yilas and Cardel, convinced him to come around to supporting this new direction. On June 26, 1950, the Yugoslav Federal Assembly passed the Basic Law on Management of State Economic Enterprises and Higher Economic Associations by the Workers' Collectives. As president of the Assembly, Tito gave a speech on the occasion where he argued that the bill itself was, quote, one of the most important bills in socialist Yugoslavia, and that its very passing was one of Yugoslavia's most democratic acts. Tito starts off by saying that the standard slogans used up until then, the slogans preaching that factories must go to the workers and that land must be delivered to the peasants, were not and could not be mere propaganda. These slogans needed to become concrete reality if the construction of socialism was to be achieved in Yugoslavia. Tito asked rhetorically if workers who, with all their energy, hope, and vigor, build the economy of new Yugoslavia and apparently overfulfill production targets, are ready to manage their own factories. According to Tito, yes, they are. In his speech, Tito declares that this new direction was not premature, but rather it was late, and the reason that it was late was because they had, quote, too many illusions, and that they were, quote, too uncritical in taking and replanting here everything that was being done in the Soviet Union. Tito turns the table. It is not they who are the revisionists, but the Soviets. Through their own research, he, Yilas, and Cardel managed to discover the un-Marxist concepts being propagated by the Soviet Union, and were now moving accordingly. For Tito, there is no uniform path to socialism, no ready-made prescriptions, and he argues that this new route for Yugoslavia is the best one, based not just on a proper appraisal of Yugoslav conditions, but also through a correct application of Marxist science, or as he said, our road to socialism consists in the application of Marxist science to the given stage in the closest possible harmony with the specific conditions existing in our country. Tito then sums up the new theoretical divisions between the Yugoslav Marxists and quote-unquote orthodox Soviet Marxism-Leninism. He says that they disagree on four things, those being A, the role of the state in the transition period and its withering away, B, the relationship of the party to the state, C, the question of the lower phase of communism, and D, the question of the state and socialist ownership of the means of production. On the first point, Tito, hearkening back to Marx and Lenin, reminds us that the state under socialism is destined to wither away. It is only the bourgeoisie which desires to reinforce the state machinery, for as Lenin had said in his famous work on the subject, the state is only ever the instrument by which one class oppresses the other. Tito acknowledges that the Yugoslav state presently is performing its proper role, firstly by combating the bourgeoisie. However, he believes that the Yugoslav state differs from the Soviet state in that by the Yugoslav state's progressive transference of economic and administrative functions over to the workers that it was in fact dying away, unlike the Soviet state. Where is the beginning of this withering away process in our country? I shall mention only the following examples. First, decentralization of the state administration, especially in the economy. Secondly, turning over the factories and economic enterprises in general to the working collectives to manage themselves, etc. The decentralization of economic and political culture and other aspects of life is not only profoundly democratic, but has inherent in it the seeds of withering away not only of centralism, but of the state in general, as a machine of force. How do things look in the Soviet Union 31 years after the October Revolution? The October Revolution made it possible for the state to take the means of production into its hands, but these means are still, after 31 years, in the hand of the state. Has the slogan, "the factories for the workers," been put into practice? Of course not. The workers still do not have any say in the management of the factories. They are managed by directors who are appointed by the state, that is, by civil service employees. The workers only have the possibility and the right to work, but this is not very different from the role of the workers in capitalist countries. The only difference for workers is that there is no unemployment in the Soviet Union, and that is all. Therefore, the leaders of the Soviet Union have not, so far, put through one of the most characteristic measures of the socialist state, that of the turning over of the factories and other economic enterprises to the workers so that they may manage them. Tito argues that because the Soviet state was highly centralized, it was greatly deviating from what is to be considered the primary goal of a socialist state, which is its self-abolition. He quotes Lenin from The State and Revolution and Engels from Anti-Düring, specifically the latter's proclamation that the first act in which the state really comes forward as the representative of society as a whole, the taking into possession of the means of production in the name of society, is at the same time its last independent act as a state. The interference of the state power in social relations becomes superfluous in one sphere after another, and then ceases of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and the direction of the process of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away. Tito reverses the allegations once more. 2 years prior, the Soviets argued that the Yugoslavs were distorting the Marxist-Leninist theory of the party, but Tito instead argues that it was truly Stalin who was betraying Lenin's view of the role of the party during the period of transition. According to Tito, the CPSU was becoming a bureaucratic entity that was losing touch with the masses. The party, Tito declares, was supposed to be a leader and an educator, but not a prosecutor. Furthermore, he criticizes the Soviets for their consistent and unceasing determination to shout out that they are nearing communism. Nowhere does Marxism speak about reaching communism by way of leaps and bounds. Although two phases are referred to, there is in reference to gradual development to a higher phase, communism, after the proletariat has taken the state power. Nevertheless, the Soviet leaders put matters as though they can determine when it is to be considered that the higher phase, communism, has been reached. This is no joke, but rather the sad truth, for everyone knows that in 1948, Molotov announced that they were entering a higher phase of communism. Here is how Marx defined the passage into the higher phase. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of individuals under division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not merely a means to live, but has become itself the primary necessity of life, after the productive forces have also increased with all-round development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be fully left behind, and society inscribe on its banner, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. That is how matters stand with the higher phase of communism. The Soviet Union is still very far from that, and of course, so are we. Tito then concludes on the matter of socialist ownership, or rather the slogan of factories to the workers. Tito highlights the necessity of education and raising the cultural level of the workers and peasants. He believed that the workers would become experienced in self-management during the process of being granted the right of managing their own factories. Through their work, they will understand the necessity of labor discipline, and in their work, in the factories, they will collectively solve the issues which they come across. Over time, as the system unfolds, the self-management of factories will simply be another fact of life, a product of Yugoslav socialist culture. From Tito's speech, we can see the new aspects of Yugoslav Marxist ideology and the basis of its future critiques of the Soviet system, those being decentralization, federalism, anti-statism, opposition to bureaucracy, and advocacy for workers' control or self-management. The immediate effects of the KPJ's new policy were limited and would take time to roll out. At first, the new institutions operating within self-managed factories only operated as elevated bodies that oversaw the fulfillment of planning goals. It was in 1952 that some of the first structural changes would occur, such as the cancellation of the state's monopoly on foreign trade. One of the biggest changes was the abandonment of collectivized agriculture, allowing peasants to withdraw from the collective farms in favor of operating small private farms. When in 1951, there were 6,804 so-called production cooperatives. By 1955, that number dwindled to just under 700. Following up on the new thesis of a Soviet bureaucracy, Tito and Cardell began to consider what this meant for their own party. According to Cardell, political parties were products of capitalism, and thus were made superfluous by revolution. Tito would add to this by saying, quote, "When socialism is developed, the Communist Party too will gradually disappear as a party." The reform thus went even further. In 1952, at the KPJ's 6th Party Congress, the party would change its name from the Communist Party of Yugoslavia to the League of Communists, SKJ. The new name being a reference to Marx's Communist League of the previous century. On the surface, the party reorganized, whilst retaining a leading role in Yugoslav society, particularly as an ideological educational institution, would pull away from direct interference in every affair of the country. In 1953, the People's Front governing coalition, which was basically the Yugoslav version of the Fatherland Front in Bulgaria or the National Front in East Germany, would also be renamed to the Socialist Alliance of Working People of Yugoslavia.